All right. Welcome, everyone. Can everybody hear me? Okay, good. It is working. Perfect. Good evening. I'm super excited that so many people showed up today in the middle of May. And it's actually a pretty decent night out there, so hopefully there'll be enough time for a walk afterwards too. We would also like to welcome our live stream audience. So we are live streaming tonight, so you'll be able to watch this later if you choose. And my name is Allison Foudy, and I'm really pleased to be a new member of the Hailey Public Library team. Joining me over there behind the screen, that's Lahela and Denon, and they're really the ones who make the magic happen. So the fact you can hear me and that everybody at home can hear me, that's thanks to them. After the presentation, there will be time for questions. I'm gonna run this mic around, so try to wait for the mic. I know sometimes the question is burning and you just forget to wait for the mic, but with the mic, they will be able to hear it through the live stream. If you forget, John will repeat your question because he is also mic'd up. So it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Probably most of you know him, local author John Rember. John was born in Sun Valley, Idaho, grew up in nearby Sawtooth Valley. He was educated at Harvard, earned his MFA at the University of Montana. He's worked as, there's a lot here, ski patrolman, wilderness ranger, technical writer, concrete and construction worker, high school teacher. That was probably the hardest one, right? Yeah, actually, Lahela knows too.
Yeah, I had trouble holding it.
A bartender, that I'd like to have us talk about that. A journalist and a professor. He taught for many years at the College of Idaho in Caldwell and in the Pacific University MFA program in Forest Grove, Oregon. John lives and writes in the Sawtooth Valley of Idaho. He's published several books, and most of them are back there. We have, I think, all of them at the library, or at least most of them, including 100 Little Pieces on the End of the World, which received the Idaho Book of the Year Honorable Mention in 2020. If you've read that book, if you haven't read that book, you should read it. If you have read that book, you know. MFA in a Box, a Why to Write book. His memoir, Traplines, Coming Home to Sawtooth Valley, which was the Idaho Book of the Year in 2004, and 3 short story collections. This evening, John will read some of his brand new work, and we are so thrilled he has chosen to share this work at the Hailey Public Library. Please join me in welcoming John Rember.
Thank you all for coming. For the past 4 years, I've been writing a journal, and I've come up with 3 years worth of journal entries, because toward the end of writing a journal, I kept waiting for things to happen and dreading the prospect that they would happen. So I slowed my pace quite a little bit. But I'd like to tell you a little bit about those journals. We're going to try to publish them by the end of this summer. And that'll give you a little context for the readings I am going to do later. In March of 2020, Julie and I were scheduled to do a book tour for 100 Little Pieces on the End of the World, my collection of meditations on the fate of industrial civilization in a post-industrial world. My publisher, the University of New Mexico Press, had arranged a series of readings, and we were looking forward to leaving our home in snow-covered central Idaho for the warm breezes of the American Southwest. COVID-19 intervened. My book tour was canceled. For the rest of 2020, we quarantined in Sawtooth Valley, listening for vaccines and rumors of vaccines, wondering how high the death toll would go. Although writing a new book is not the first thing you think of after publishing a new book, I realized that our times needed a witness, even one whose view was limited by mountains. I took being a witness seriously. I imagined a Roman citizen in the year 400, one thoughtful enough to see that a seemingly eternal civilization was showing signs of mortality. If that citizen had kept a journal of his everyday life and its fears, joys, and hopes, it would be a much studied historical document, especially during times when civilization was falling apart. I determined I would write down our everyday lives and thoughts during the pandemic. Every Monday, I would publish a 2,000-word entry. The resulting journals are in 3 volumes, each approximately 100,000 words. Things add up. And the first is titled Endnotes. It focuses on the unvaccinated first year of the plague. Its entries are shocking because of millions of mostly forgotten deaths, and because they remind us that at some level, Americans have realized they're helpless before events. They have defended against that realization with denial, apathy, and a fierce effort to control arenas small enough to be controlled. The first entries indicate our country was making those efforts from the very beginning. My own efforts centered on privately remembering what was being officially forgotten. The second volume is titled Ghost Dance. It expands the meaning of plague to include war, climate disaster, and human evil. It is a dark and meditative collection. It lives up to its title, which recalls 19th century Native American ceremonies designed to push white settlers back to Europe. Such ceremonies, however ineffectual, enraged white people and were the nominal cause for the massacre at Wounded Knee. Ghost Dance explores the consequences of deliberate unconsciousness in personal, civic, and international matters. It suggests that without consciousness, our ceremonies and rituals no longer hold any power. Writing Ghost Dance, I tried to separate what I saw from what I thought I saw. It was an inexact science. I did become adept at expressing forbidden thoughts. Aftermath is the final volume. It begins with the forbidden thought that we are now living among ruins, cultural, political, and spiritual. For the moment, life continues, but there is no going back to a complacent 20th century first world existence. We have an economy for the ages: pillage, salvage, bondage. It is not so different from what was happening in most of the rest of the world last century, but this time it's happening here. The situation has already created lethal feedback loops in social behavior and economics. My response has been to focus on Julie's and my shared existence, where we can live and love to the best of our abilities, at least until the outside world comes crashing in. I've ended up focusing on finding agency in the only place it still exists, between individuals willing to treat each other with dignity and compassion and forgiveness. I've reacted to the undeniable tragedy of our times by turning toward moments small, good, and deeply conscious. The 3 short pieces I'm going to read tonight are all from Aftermath, from the last volume, and I hope you agree with my assessment of them. The first piece is called After Many a Summer. I wrote it on May 29th, 2023, almost 2 years ago now, so it's not really new work. Julie had a birthday last week. She celebrated it by getting in the car and heading for Yellowstone Park and Chico Hot Springs Resort. I was lucky enough to get to go with her. At Yellowstone, we stayed at the Lake Hotel, the park's oldest hotel. At Chico, we stayed in the Warren Wing, named after Warren Oates, a once rising movie star now mostly remembered for his role in the hyper-violent Western, The Wild Bunch. Oates was a regular at Chico before Chico was cool, and his support of the resort helped transform it from a funky, cheap, rundown place into a high-end destination for pleasure-seeking nomads. The hallways of the Warren Wing are covered with photos of Warren Oates. Movie stills, of course, but also shots of Oates and various female companions. He's 40 years gone now, and those women are no longer young. Chico's changed as well. It's an increasingly famous culinary destination. Demographics being what they are, every evening its dining room is full of widows. Women in their 70s and 80s in groups of 2 and 3 and 4. They talk and laugh together and tell stories about the men who used to be in their lives. Possibly they tell stories about Warren Oates, possibly about being married to Warren Oates. He married 4 times, which implies some good stories, if not always happy ones. Oates died of a heart attack at age 53. That seems young to me these days. It must have seemed really young to Warren Oates. Death must have been a disappointment. He had a ranch in Montana, scripts in his mailbox, and no matter how difficult or wearing the movie business or the divorce courts became, all he had to do was show up at Chico and they'd take him in and ask if he was hungry or needed a soak. Julie and I visited the hot pools at Chico every morning before breakfast. We stayed there until we woke up. It's the preferred way to return to consciousness for aging, pleasure-seeking nomads. The Lake Hotel had been nice too, although they had only been open a week and were still hiring wait staff. The cooks were working out kinks in the menu, and there was a line at the door to the dining room. We eventually got seated and had a good meal. The hotel hallways had photos and paintings on their walls, but no movie stars. If there had been, one of them would have been of a young Jack Nicholson smiling in the final frame of the 1980 film, The Shining. It's not good to have seen The Shining if you're staying at the Lake Hotel, which was opened in 1891 by the Northern Pacific Railroad. It's been refurbished since then, but it carries in its corridors and great rooms all the weight of its 134 years. In display cases in the lobby, there are photographs of deceased people in old-style hats and coats, impossibly formal and stern. Their eyes stare out from their photos as if they're trapped there. You decide not to apply for the caretaker's job for the coming Wyoming winter. You find yourself glad that the place is crowded with frivolous fellow tourists. You even welcome the happy screams of their children, comforting yourself with the knowledge that not all screams are as happy. Earlier in the day, we had stopped at Old Faithful. We walked into its viewing area from the parking lot and asked a park employee when it was scheduled to go off. 10 minutes, we were told, give or take 10 minutes. Old Faithful is still faithful, but not always punctual. We quickly joined 1,000 onlookers, most of whom had been waiting a half hour or longer. A boy and a girl, 20-somethings, were sitting on a bench in front of us, and 10 minutes later, when the geysers started showing signs of life, the boy set his phone on a tripod, got down on one knee, and gave the girl a ring. In the background, water and steam shot high in the sky. 1,000 cheers for Old Faithful. 1,000 cell phones shook at the end of 1,000 arms. Yes, yes, I will, the girl shouted over the crowd. The boy kissed her. She kissed him back. The crowd, noticing what was going on, stopped cheering Old Faithful and started cheering the new couple. I knew you were going to do that, said the girl. I hoped that for the rest of her life, whenever she said those words, she was going to be as happy as she was at that moment. After Old Faithful, we visited the Artist's Paint Pots, a series of multicolored mud springs on a hillside a half mile from its parking lot. 100 other people accompanied us, and we all watched as pools of wet clay slurped and blubbered and spewed thick, ropey streamers into the air. It was comically organic, as though goofy amphibians were living a few inches below the surface, burping and farting and muttering rude things in amphibian language about tourists. It's impossible to see yourself as a serious naturalist when you're walking around the artist's paint pots. You can't even see yourself as a serious artist. You have an impulse to finger paint. You realize it's a good thing that the viewing platforms are surrounded by railings and keep off delicate thermal areas signs, ensuring you and your fingers safe distance from the boiling mud. We left the paint pots and stopped at Norris Geyser Basin, home of Steamboat Geyser, the world's best of breed, which shoots water 300 feet in the air if you're lucky enough to be there when it goes off. Dormant periods range from 3 days to 50 years. When we've walked to it during past visits, there have been retirees sitting in lawn chairs, drinking wine and waiting for an eruption. None of them were waiting with an engagement ring. The basin contains other violently unstable geological features. Now and then, the Norris geysers have produced steam explosions and rock shrapnel rather than steaming sunlit rainbows. If the Yellowstone caldera blows its top, it'll likely happen first at Norris. So there's always a little shiver of excitement when you walk around its boardwalks. We saw, at least we think we saw out of the corners of our eyes, some real artists at Norris, photographers in mossy oak camouflage, carrying mossy oak cameras with giant mossy oak lenses. They were serious people, as if they knew that any amphibians under Norris would be the giant Triassic kind, with giant teeth that would grab an arm or leg and pull you under the thin crust. National Geographic would pay well for a photo of one of those if you and your camera survived that first savage bite and jerk into the underworld. Yellowstone encourages undersurface fantasies. You know there's a vast magma chamber down there somewhere, big enough if all of its dissolved gases were suddenly released to bring a decade-long volcanic ash winter to the northern hemisphere, putting an end to wars, governments, agriculture, stray human thoughts of free will, and any surviving stray humans. I never met Warren Oates. My first visit to Chico was in 1988, and he died in 1982. I did see The Wild Bunch when it came out in the summer of 1969. It was the only movie I've ever seen that made me physically ill due to the amount of blood it spilled. Slow motion in the most violent scenes hadn't helped. When I finally got to Chico, I thought the Warren Wing had been named for Warren Beatty, who had made a 1975 movie that I did like, Shampoo. That movie portrayed the painful aging of a good-looking hairdresser with so many women in his life he couldn't keep them from ganging up on him. He had thought that sleeping with his clients would keep him young. If you've seen any recent photos of Warren Beatty, you'll understand that was a bad idea. No harm, no foul was my reaction when I found out I had confused the two Warrens. By then, I had deliberately forgotten the blood and gore of the Wild Bunch, and what I now recognize as the psychological violence of Shampoo didn't seem violent to me at all. These days, I can see that it was a hyper-violent movie as well. Human beings do horrible things to each other in Shampoo, and it means nothing to any of them. The movie teaches that shallowness can be a defense against tragedy. True enough, but that's an argument that favors tragedy. According to Google Maps, it's 7 hours and 4 minutes from Chico Hot Springs to our home in Sawtooth Valley. It took us less than that due to Montana's lax speed limits and my tendency to pick up the pace when heading for the barn. It was a beautiful drive. It had been a long winter in our corner of the country, but at Livingston, the grass was greening and the wildflowers were out. We saw elk and antelope and deer, lots of cows and baby cows. The world was new again. Even Butte, the city built around the giant pit filled with purple acid, looked halfway fresh. At the Big Hole, we drove through burned areas on either side of the road, but grass was beginning to rise around the blackened trunks of trees. In Salmon, we stopped for groceries and then continued on up the Salmon River, which was flooding banks lined with new leafing cottonwoods. We barely slowed going through Chalice. In an hour, we were at our front door. It felt good to end our time as nomads. It felt good to rein in our impulse toward pleasure. While Julie was cooking dinner, I put on hip boots and went out with a shovel to patch muskrat holes in the irrigation ditch. It's hard, muddy work, and I was hungry enough I didn't stay with it long. It felt good to be doing something useful. When you first go on a road trip, you think it would be good to travel forever, living in hotels, eating at restaurants, getting poolside massages at hot water spas. But the sights you see and the meals you have eaten and the moments in the sun on a chase long begin to recall other trips, other summers, other companions. You remember movies and realize that they contain more meaning for the person you are now than for the person you were when you saw them. Your age shoots back through your life and changes it. You realize you've outlived friends and family and a bunch of the people that you've seen in movies. You realize a good many people will outlive you. These things need to be thought about. New experience needs to be brought to your old consciousness, preferably while sitting in the Spartan comforts of home. No need to come to any conclusions, but you do have to realize that as you get older, the world gets deeper. Each new experience layers over previous versions of yourself. Your life belongs to those people as much as it belongs to you. You owe them something for delivering you to the present. To call it gratitude is probably oversimplifying things. Well, that was our trip to Yellowstone. I used to be a travel writer, and old habits die hard, I guess. My travel writing was all over the map, too. This piece is called The Criminal Side of the Family. It was written on February 28th, 2024. Before you start thinking that I'm going to expose the Rember crime family's many crimes, let me say that we didn't lie, murder anybody, steal horses, or inflate the value of our properties to get a better rate on bank loans. We didn't have a lot of property to inflate. Anyway, a loan from the bank was seen as a one-way ticket to legal problems at best, indentured servitude at worst. If you wanted something, you saved up and paid cash for it. If you couldn't afford it, you found your happiness elsewhere. When I wrote my father's obituary, I kept it brief, emphasizing he was a good father and friend. I noted that he had been a Union man and a loyal Democrat all his life. He loved hard work, and, I wrote, his checks were good. I received letters about that obituary, several people saying those four final words were a doorway into my father's character, and good words for anybody's tombstone. I agreed, although I had scattered his ashes over a meadow high in the Sawtooths, and he didn't have a tombstone unless you counted the surrounding peaks. We were poor but honest, and those too aren't bad words for a tombstone, no matter where it is. The idea of the criminal side of the family arose when one of my father's cousins retired to Boise. He was a garrulous man who had spent his life selling cars, real estate, and fishing tackle. And he liked people and making new friends, and as my father said with some affection, he had a line of bullshit a mile long. When this cousin got to Boise, he checked the phone book to see if there were any other Rembers. He found the number of a family who had moved into one of the new suburbs. He called them up. Rember was not a common name, so he assumed that he was related to them in some way. He introduced himself, said he was part of the family, and offered to buy lunch. They refused, he said. Once they figured out what I wanted, they wouldn't talk to me. They told me not to call them again and hung up. They had an East Coast accent somewhere back there, New Jersey, Boston. You know what I think, he said? I think they're in the witness protection program. Somebody took our name out of a phone book. They thought they'd be safe from the mafia with a new identity. That was our introduction to the criminal side of the family, and their crime was that they, shady characters that they were, had stolen our good name. For a while, we half expected to see dark-windowed sedans cruising slowly up and down the highway outside our gate, but they didn't show. A year later, those other Rembers disappeared from Boise. We went back to being an honest bunch for the most part. After a while, I started suspecting there wasn't any witness protection program, and that the Rembers who had moved to Boise were trying to hide, but not from the mafia. You hear about men who have a family on one end of the country and another family on the other end, and neither family knows about the other. Maybe these people were hiding from angry in-laws. Maybe they had stolen an inheritance meant for a stepmother or an extra set of children. Maybe they were the extra set of children. I know that Rembers first came to Idaho from Canada, and a bunch of them still live around Montreal. They came over from Scotland in the 18th century to land granted by the British Crown, land stolen from the French, who had stolen it from the Indians. I know this because one of the Canadian Rembers had discovered the Idaho Rembers and had sent us a family history that extended into the 20th century, listing births, deaths, spouses, occupations, and a scattering of personal histories. Rembers had emigrated to Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, and two brothers had come south to fight on the Union side in the American Civil War. I did know from our own family history that my great-grandfather had shown up in Hailey in 1883 and had prospered, becoming the county sheriff around 1890. The history sent to us from Canada ended with a warning. You're welcome to come visit, but don't try to get any of the loot. In some distant Canadian wonderland, people lived like royalty on their grant of crown land. They were a crime family by way of settler imperialism, but they weren't about to confess they hadn't been on that land since time immemorial. I began to wonder if any of the Rembers belonged anywhere. I imagined that family who showed up in Boise full of the hope and optimism of a new start, only to find that the people they were trying to escape had beaten them there, and they had no choice but to pack the car and become refugees again. Who were they? Why weren't they willing to have lunch with my father's cousin? Why move to Boise of all places? Questions without answers. No unbroken story led from Scotland to Idaho. But stories break all the time. My grandmother's house in Hailey was torn down to make way for a McMansion, and the only place you can find the Rember name is in the cemetery. We're gone from the Wood River Valley, thanks to death from old age, gentrification, and the lure of new territory on the Salmon River. I doubt if we'll ever call Hailey home again. Resort communities in the West have a circular history, one that erodes individual events and identity. The endless repetition of ski seasons focuses on what will occur rather than what's already happened. And while the play goes on as always, the cast keeps changing. People come to the Wood River Valley thinking they're unique individuals and never realize that they're seen as a type. But if you look at the obituaries of the male octogenarians in the local Idaho Mountain Express, you'll see stories of entrepreneurs and corporate managers who retired to Idaho with a second or third wife and school-aged children. They see their new home as a frontier and their arrival as the very start of local history. They ski and fly fish and dine in local restaurants for a few decades until they get too old to navigate icy walkways. They die in warmer places, but they live on in their local replacements, some of whom marry their widows and ex-wives. Their stories are as carefully crafted as anything a witness protection program ever came up with. If a crime family is involved, the details never make it to the obituary page. About once a year, I think about sending my DNA to Ancestry.com to see if I'm related to any serial murderers, protected witnesses, Republicans, or if I might be able to launch a takeover of the British throne by the Plantagenets, who were a crime family. Thus far, I've resisted the temptation. The legend of a freebooting Scot who maneuvered his way into a grant of stolen land. No telling why he was in a hurry to leave Scotland, but it might have been more than the climate. It's better than finding out my DNA has passed through 60 generations of serfs and peasants, the sort of people Thomas Hobbes had in mind when he wrote about lives nasty, brutish, and short. I do know I come from people who were damaged in body and soul by the Great Depression, and to the extent that their trauma has been recorded in my genes, I have a sensitivity to the violence inherent to recessions, real estate bubbles, and false dreams. My father was born into an intact family, but by the time he died, that family had been scattered across the country. They recovered mostly from the 1930s, but all of them bore the marks of lonely struggle. I'm incredibly fortunate to have had parents with the will to make something from nothing. My life has been pleasant and civilized. When I've had bad luck, it's been of the good variety. When I've had luck, it's been of the good variety, and bad luck too. My line of bullshit has gotten a bit shorter as the years have gone by. I've paid all my credit card bills on time. I haven't had to have the FBI invent my life. As far as I know, my crimes have been all misdemeanors. When I've encountered life's pitfalls, there have been always ways to climb back out. That's a lot of words to put on a tombstone, even if I did leave all the bad parts out. If whoever orders the engraving is paying by the letter, my epitaph will get savagely edited. Even long epitaphs are incomplete anyway. Life is too complicated for language, no matter how hard you try to capture it. About the best you can do is greet St. Peter with an entertaining collection of almost true excuses and hope and pray he hasn't heard them before. This next piece was listed on the library website as My Life as a Short Person. The actual title was My Short Life as a Smart Person. And I wore my cowboy boots tonight just in case. But I was wondering if it went out as life as a short person, what the audience was going to look like. And so anyway, here we are. Some of us taller than others. I wrote this on May 21st, 2024, a little less than a year ago. High school in Hailey, Idaho from 1964 to 1968 was not a fun time for me. I spent most of it alienated, awkward, lonely, worried that I would die a virgin, worried that I wouldn't die a virgin and would get a girl pregnant when I was 16, worried that I would flunk out of college, worried that once I flunked out I would get drafted and die in a rice paddy in Vietnam, leaving my triplets without a father. I worried about everyone except me dying in nuclear war, leaving me as the lonely witness to infinite horror. I worried about my parents dying of old age at ages much younger than I am now. I worried that my brain, which I had been told was a dangerous, sharp object, would turn against me, and I would die in a locked ward in State Hospital South in Blackfoot, where people from all over Idaho were sent when they got too depressed to function. I worried that my recurring fantasies of violence would get me sent to the reformatory for juveniles in St. Anthony, where teenagers from all over Idaho were sent when they became too feral for the local justices of the peace to handle. I plotted the murders of Wood River High School bullies and worried I wouldn't get away with them. 60 years later, after a career of teaching adolescents of various ages how to write, I can see I wasn't the only kid in my high school with worries. We were all worried about something, at least if we were paying attention to our world, which was peaceable on the surface, brutal in its undercurrents, dark in its future. People could and did get sucked into evil, did die in Vietnam, did get sent to reform school and mental institutions, did become parents who spent irreplaceable portions of their lives raising kids they wouldn't have had if they'd had a choice. My social awkwardness managed to get me to college rather than sidetracking me into working to support a family. And college kept me from getting drafted, at least until student deferments were abolished. Then it was just a high enough lottery number that kept me a civilian. Nuclear war was a real worry, big enough even now to invoke the multiverse's weak anthropic principle. I'm here, me, alive. So I didn't die in a nuclear holocaust, no matter how high the odds were that it would happen. Other realities and other selves, infinities of them, were not so fortunate. If the barriers between alternate universes weren't so strong, I'd have an alternate self refugee problem. There were a few moments of benign self-consciousness in my adolescence when I intuited that my problems were relatively minor in the big scheme of things and that they would pass. But other teenagers had problems that were, in a phrase, lasting and deadly. Some lonelinesses I now recognize were far worse than anything I experienced. Some families were far more violent than mine. Some of my classmates I can now recognize were being abused, sexually and otherwise, by families and family friends. People were forced into religions, social classes, academic categories, impossible conceptions of personal beauty and behavior. Nobody escaped the violence of being sorted, diagnosed, and emotionally altered to fit predestined family roles. None of us, given the forces arrayed against us, were able to look out for our own interests, considering that most of those interests were corrupted by the icky narcissism of adolescence, where impulse rules and self-pity is the addictive drug of choice. That was fortunate. But the people who were supposed to protect us from ourselves and our world, even when they had our welfare in mind, didn't always provide the protection we needed. My parents had aimed me at college. They had told me that becoming a parent in high school would effectively end my lifetime happiness. They had married at 21 and 22. They had wanted children, but once they had them, their lives, which had been carefree and happy for the first years of marriage, were filled with hard work, enormous responsibilities, and the tragedy of losing a child. They wanted and loved their children, but their lives, deeply constrained by a lack of discretionary income, showed me how much of a sacrifice it had been to raise two sons, lose one, and come up with me as his replacement. I had a justifiable horror of parenthood. I had no doubt that my brothers and I had trashed our parents' lives. My peers in Hailey reinforced that conviction, as they included ostracized, unwed mothers, high school dropouts working as assistant auto mechanics, girls who gained weight and then disappeared to live with relatives for a year, only to return to school sadder, wiser, and alone. When I finally got to college, birth control pills were in wide use. The sexual revolution had overthrown centuries of rigid morality, and losing one's virginity was a relatively worry-free experience. It occurred without fear of pregnancy or much ceremony or commitment, for that matter. I sometimes use my experience as a teacher to explain not having children, saying perfectly good parents can end up with perfectly awful kids. Behind that statement is the larger gamble parents take with genetics, accidents, drugs, and family trauma. Also, Freud's insight that among humanity's primal bands, there was a violent antagonism between young and old, one that now and then ended in murder and cannibalism. Biology ensures that once you have children, whether they're cannibals or not, you don't normally wish you hadn't had them. Pheromones and hormones and cultural pressures create people willing to forget their dreams, work for decades at jobs they merely tolerate, and pass their dreams on to a newer generation. Once, after I'd graduated from college and had a teaching job, my mother asked me when I would get married and have kids. Never, I said. She told me that not getting married and having children would wreck my life. I reminded her the last time she warned me not to wreck my life, it involved having kids. You're being terribly selfish, she said. I dreamed of grandchildren. I should say that by this time her Alzheimer's was in its early stages. Her ability to separate her own life from those of her children was gone, as was her ability to refrain from echoing the cultural expectations she had been raised with. The district guidance counselor during my time as a grade school and high school student in Wood River was a pleasant-looking, heavy-set woman, middle-aged and single, with a broken engagement in her past. She had spent her 20s in college and grad school, and her 30s and 40s taking care of parents who were both stricken with Parkinson's. She was highly intelligent, but her life had warped her outlook, and her outlook warped her guidance counseling. She was notorious for advising female students to forego college and get married so they wouldn't grow old without kids. She guided a few promising male students into the Naval and Air Force academies while there was a war on. While none of them died in combat, more than one died relatively young of stress-related diseases and alcohol. She told lots of people they weren't college material, which caused a few of them to wave university diplomas in her face years later. Her life had not gone according to plan, in that she wasn't any different from the rest of us. But the hijacking of her life by her parents' illnesses had forced her into a weird definition of her own role in the world. Her guidance of high school juniors and seniors into marriage and the military was an effort to put the illusion of free will into her own and her charges' lives. It didn't work. The 60s were hard on marriages and the military both. She did maintain good relationships with college admissions officers across the West and shuttled students she deemed college material in promising directions. For the misfits, the delinquent, the alienated, the creatives, the inarticulate, she didn't do well at all. I hit the bullseye in all those categories. She saw me as troubled but intelligent. That was an irresistible invitation to project her own hopes and frustrations onto my innocent little head. With my parents' permission, she gave me my first IQ test when I was 8 years old. I aced it. Looking back, I can see she cheated for me. She gave me far more time to solve problems than the test allowed, and she must have given other hints about right answers that I picked up on. I ended up with an embarrassingly high IQ, which she reported to my parents, who leaked it to my older brother and to their friends and to me. The information did not endear me to family or community or myself. The next year, my guidance counselor arranged for me to skip 4th grade. Between the IQ test, skipping a grade at Ketchum Elementary School, and spending the summers in Sawtooth Valley, far away from my classmates, I was well on my way to be an inadequately socialized and freakishly smart kid in an arena where being smart was not at all cool. She never let up. When it was time for college, she helped me get into Harvard. She edited and revised my application until it conformed to the sensibilities of a sophisticated admissions committee familiar with the narrative concept of the Bildungsroman, or initiation novel. In a Bildungsroman, a talented rustic journeys to the big city, learns its ways, and becomes fabulously successful, and then returns to his hometown to treat the people who scorned him with kindness and generosity. My guidance counselor died in her 60s of hereditary Parkinson's, which is not a good way to go. But she lives on in my life for better or for worse. Being smart as Ted Kaczynski might tell you, allows you to break certain societal rules. You shouldn't take it as far as Ted did, but you can look critically at marriage and children, careers in law and medicine, team sports, conspicuous consumption, and conventional morality. But being smart is also a rigid and limiting role. Perhaps because I've never felt very smart, I've been hyper-conscious of the moves you must make to appear smart. That first IQ test, as bogus as it was the moment my story stopped being about free will and started being about fate. Over the years, I've gotten smarter, trying to live up to the role I was cast into. It helped that I learned to love books. It helped that once I learned how to write, I tried to put my experience into words. It helped I never mistook a diploma for an education, my own opinions for facts, or my decisions for outcomes. My life has in no way resembled a Bildungsroman. I'm still a rustic, and I will forever come up short in the forgiveness department. I can still remember every cutting remark, every scornful glance I received during my high school years. I do know that in the end, God or karma or the laws of physics catch up to all of us, the cruel and the kind, the smart and the stupid, the educated and the ignorant alike. If that fact allows for a few moments of schadenfreude, if somebody gets his before you get yours, that's one of life's guilty pleasures. In my case, it's more guilt than pleasure, because I've finally realized that the smartest thing you can do with your life is to make sure that by its end, that your kindnesses outnumber your cruelties. That's hard because we live in a cruel world, and the thing we call the self is not a personal creation. Selves are community projects, and they're handed to you well before you're old enough to understand that it's a loan you'll have to repay. You'll repay it by spending your life being the person others, some of them long dead, have imagined into existence. It's your life's work. It matters whether the community that created you allows you to look over your own shoulder. If it does, you can now and then think about your life, wonder how you got to where you are, and take an occasional day off from worrying where you're going. You can even commit the occasional act of generosity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a gift that you shared those with us first. We have time for a couple questions probably. Is that okay?
That's okay.
Okay.
It's okay.
Just checking the watch. Here we go. Who's got a question? Or a comment? Or there's books to buy in the back. Should we just do another round of applause?
If everyone's been stunned into silence.
That's kind of what it sounds like, but we could do another round of applause, and then I do want to remind you that there are books in the back as well.
Thank you all very much for coming tonight. I very much appreciate it. And
thank you.
It would be nice to have seen some class of 1968 Wood River High School students. Not 68 though, Jay, right? Well, Jay and I attended Wood River High School together, and then we worked together as Forest Service workers for a while. I didn't last as long as Jay did, though.